Welcome to the 15th Annual New York Equal Pay Day. I'm Beverly Neufeld, President and founder of PowHer New York. We're a network of over 100 organizations representing different issues, different regions, and different groups, but we all have one goal, and that's attaining women's economic equality. Thank you for joining today's special forum, Roads to Women's Economic Recovery and the Future. It is proudly co-hosted by PowHer New York and Attorney General Letitia James, who you'll hear from in a moment. If you're on social media, please use the hashtag EqualPayNY. And if you have any questions, you can email us at info@powherny.org. Since 2007, New York advocates have rallied on Equal Pay Day, usually on the steps of City Hall. We are wearing red and seeing red because women were still in the red. Over the years, we raised awareness and we successfully pushed for stronger laws. And we have succeeded in doing that. Throughout the years, now Attorney General Tish James has been a partner in our work. I can still remember 2008 when advocates were testifying inside City Hall and we were calling for some specific reforms. It was then City Council member James who stood up and said, "We can do that." And she's been with us every Equal Pay Day since. Then, as public advocate, she released influential reports. She raised the volume on the disparities in the private and public sector, and particularly highlighted the wage gap for women of color. And she worked on concrete solutions. One solution was the trend-setting 2017 salary history ban. It had ripple effects across the country, and it changed a very common practice of basing wages on prior salary rather than on your qualifications to do the job. Her unwavering support for equal pay and so many of the other issues that are important to women's future has just grown as she has become the New York Attorney General, the first woman and person of color to hold that esteemed position. On this Equal Pay Day, our 15th, we are so proud to host this forum with our longtime champion and wage equity hero, Shiro. Let me welcome Attorney General Letitia James.
Thank you, Bev, for that kind introduction. You are, in fact, the hero. You're the brainchild of all of this, and particularly gathering us all together to recognize Women's Equal Pay Day. And so I thank you for your leadership. And I want to thank all of the women who are here on the call today. Gloria Middleton, one of my Shiros as well, the president of local CWA 1180, Sahir Kawaja, and make sure I say that and pronounce it correctly because we all want to be heard and seen. And of course, Leah Rambo, and of course, someone who is very close to me, someone who is the deputy in our office, focusing all on social justice, Meghan Faux. And so, Bev, you are truly an ally and a champion for women across the state. You and I have worked together for so many years, since my days in the city council and my days as public advocate. We worked together to pass the salary history ban so that employers in New York City would no longer be allowed to ask prospective employees about their previous salary. This practice perpetuates lower wages for women and penalizes them throughout their career and even penalizes them during their retirement. And last year, this became statewide law so that no employer in New York State is allowed to ask you about your salary history. And it was as a result of all of the women who are on this call today, including Ms. Middleton, who I know was instrumental in litigation because she recognizes that litigation is a force and both a shield and a sword in the march for justice. As public advocate, as you mentioned, I also published reports on gender pay equity in New York City's workforce and in city agencies. And those reports highlighted another major contributor to the wage gap, gender segregation in the workplace, and the fact that women tend to work in certain kinds of lower paying jobs and industries. And we all need to take a moment and say a prayer to all of those women in Atlanta who lost their lives. There were 8 people killed, but 6 were Asian women who were working in low wage jobs. And not only was it a crime against hate, but it was a crime of misogyny as well. And these issues, my friends, are not new. We all know that equal pay for women has been a long-term struggle, but the challenges women workers face before have only been worsened by the pandemic. I often refer to it as the feminization of poverty, which is a real concept, a real phenomenon, a real issue. It is an undeniable fact that women have been disproportionately affected during this crisis. And prior to the pandemic, women already faced a severe wealth gap. Women are paid 89 cents for every dollar paid to men, and the pay gap is even more dramatic for women of color. Black women are paid only 64 cents, and Latino women only 55 cents for every dollar paid by a man. But now, during this pandemic, women are facing yet another layer of challenges, from unemployment to balancing work to homeschool, caregiving, and much more. We know that industries dominated by women have been devastated as a result of this pandemic. Women have lost 1 million more jobs than men during this economic downturn. And because sectors that women tend to work in, like hospitality, education, and even government, have seen the greatest job losses. Women of color have struggled in particular, showing that though we may all be in the same boat, we are not all in the same boat, and that there's some boats that are drowning. Employment for Black women is down nearly 10% from last year, close to double the decrease that white women workers faced in the same period. And employment rates for Latino are also down by 8.6. And for Asian, API women, Asian Pacific Islander women, they're down as well. And so it's really critically important that we join together to talk about these issues. It's a very serious challenge for all of us. And even those who have managed to continue working, they've struggled. Many of our frontline workers, like grocery store cashiers and nursing assistants, are women of color who have been working throughout this pandemic at greater risk for low wages. We must work together to ensure that all women, especially women of color, can work with equal pay and dignity. And for all of those women who have lost their lives as a result of this pandemic, because they sacrificed, they had to go to work for all of us, to serve all of us, we pray for them and we keep them in our thoughts and our prayers. And that's why this conversation today is so important. There are so many systemic changes needed to foster an economy and a society that values women's work and expands opportunities for women. And the speakers who are joining us today are all experts in their field, and I'm grateful to them for sharing their expertise in order to help us chart a path for where we must go from here. We cannot return to normal. We've got to return to a new reality. And the reality is that we've got to build up women, promote women, include women in the economy, because when women work, families do better, our economy does better, and even our society does better. In fact, in nations led by women, the infection rate is lower than it is in those countries led by men. And that should tell you something. The economic losses and hardships during this pandemic have shown us how much our economy is held up by women, especially in low-wage jobs, for caregiving jobs, and so many jobs. And now more than ever, I believe we all understand how workers in low-wage jobs, including caregivers and domestic workers, help our economy and society to function. We must do more to value and support these workers and to make sure they are paid well for what they do. Beyond valuing women's work, we must also ensure that women can access opportunities to advance in their careers and undo gender segregation in the workplace. We need more women bosses. We need more women to hold C-suites. We need more women in leadership. We need more women of corporations and not-for-profits. We need more women in elected office. We need more women in journalism, in front of the camera, behind the camera. We need women in major positions. It is critically important that women in New York are aware of their rights in the workplace and aware of the opportunities, including but not limited to construction as well. And these include the right to discuss your salary with colleagues and the right to be paid equally for substantially similar work. And the substantially similar work standard is a law that went into effect last year. It requires employers to determine whether their employees, even if they have different titles or roles, are being paid equally if their work is performed under similar conditions and is substantially similar in terms of overall skill, effort, and responsibility. These laws are crucial in the fight for equal pay. And as an Attorney General, I'm committed to enforcing New York State's laws and making sure that women receive the compensation and treatment they deserve and are entitled to under the law. Show me the money, show me the money really should have some meaning. My office operates a task force for women, and I encourage any woman who has questions about their rights and suspects she is being treated unfairly and is being compensated unfairly to contact our office. We have a lot of work ahead of us to recover from the devastating effects of the pandemic. It has laid bare some of the deepest wounds and weaknesses in our society: economic inequality, racial injustice, gender inequality, and lack of access to care. We cannot go back to the way things were. It is up to us to dismantle the system which has held us back as women and has harmed women of color, especially during this past year. We know the road to recovery must be more inclusive, gender equitable, and most importantly, just. And it's important that all voices be heard and that everyone is brought to the table. We must include a plan to lift women and workers up and ensure that they have the resources, recognition, and compensation they deserve. As women, we must stand together and fight for one another, for none of us is free until all of us is free. I thank each and every one of you for joining us on this effort and this morning and being a part of this conversation as to how we can achieve gender equity together for all women. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Attorney General, for really kicking off our discussion today, centered on the struggles and needs of women now, but also, talking about and thinking about the future so that we can solve some of the problems that caused the disparities, but also the suffering from the pandemic. The stakes couldn't be higher. Just a year ago, we switched our in-person equal pay day to an online equal pay day. And 1 year later, we all are looking back at the challenges of the pandemic. And I want to say our network of partners has been working so hard. We're stronger, we're more committed than ever to gender and racial equality. And we are focused on an equitable recovery and a bright future for women. And that's the topic of our conversation today. Today's conversation is grounded in some work that we've done all year in creating the roadmap for women's economic recovery. And you can find that, we can send that to you. It really looks at inclusive gender justice. And what that means is that we're looking at all women, and we are looking particularly the women who have given up so much, and not just during the pandemic, but before, women of color. And we are calling on our leaders to push a gender-focused, anti-racist agenda so that we can make substantial progress. That's the lens that we're looking through today. And our panelists are going to talk about pay equity in terms of low-wage workers, opportunities for higher wages, and the role that laws and policies play in change. On that note, I am very excited to say that you'll hear about a new piece of legislation that was just introduced, and that is requiring employers to disclose salary ranges, giving those who are seeking jobs the information that they need. It's a game changer. You'll hear about that just in a few minutes. To moderate our panel today and introduce our speakers, I am honored to introduce to you Meghan Faux, who's the Chief Deputy Attorney General for Social Justice. Prior to joining the Office of the Attorney General, she worked on legal services in New York City and Brooklyn, and she focused on financial justice, fair housing, family matters, and has done amazing work with the Attorney General. So I want to introduce our moderator. Welcome, Meghan Faux.
Thank you, Beverly, for that kind introduction and for all that PowHer New York has done to address pay equity in New York State. So to really look at pay equity, the first thing we're going to focus on is jobs that women typically hold and how low wage how low wages have left so many economically vulnerable with really devastating impacts during the pandemic. And so I'm very pleased to introduce our first panelist. Dr. C. Nicole Mason is the president and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, a leading voice on pay equity, economic policies, and research impacting women. She is the youngest person currently leading one of the major think tanks in DC and one of the few women of color to do so. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Mason. So my first question for you is, women who work in low wage and sub minimum wage jobs have been some of those hardest hit during the pandemic. What is the reality for those workers, or what was the reality for those workers before COVID, and what is it now?
So I just want to start out by thanking Attorney General Tish James for all the work that she's done over the years. I worked with Tish James when I was at NYU running the Women of Color Policy Network, and also thank Bev Neufeld for inviting me here today. This conversation is one that we've been having for decades and for many, many years. And the pandemic has brought into focus many of the struggles and social inequalities that we know women have been experiencing before the pandemic, especially women of color and lower wage workers. Since the start of the pandemic, we've lost more than 5 million jobs. Women have lost 4 times as many jobs as men during the pandemic. And many of those are in lower wage jobs because women are disproportionately and overrepresented in the hardest hit sectors: service, leisure, hospitality, education, and healthcare services. Many of these jobs are lower wage jobs with few benefits and low pay, and without benefits like paid sick leave and health insurance. So before the pandemic, even though we were celebrating the fact that women were 50% of the workforce, what we understood is that for many women, they were still facing an enormous amount of economic insecurity and vulnerability, struggling to make ends meet. And as a result of the pandemic, all of those challenges came into sharp focus. And those workers were the first to fall out of the workforce. Those women and those workers were also least likely to be able to work remotely. So when and they were employed in sectors that in order to earn a living, to get paid, you have to show up. And with schools and daycares closed, it caused an additional burden for these women workers. And when we think about the impact of the pay gap on these workers, it's really important to underscore in this moment. The pay gap exacerbates moments like this when there's an economic downturn and crisis, because these workers have very few savings. They have very few vacation. They have no benefits, no vacation, so that if they have a sick or ill family member, they cannot afford to take off. Literally, they lose pay and they lose earnings, which has a direct impact on whether or not they're able to put food on the table, cover rent, and provide for their families. One of the other important things to understand about these workers that often gets lost in the conversation is that many of these workers are the primary breadwinners in their families. So by that, I mean their incomes contribute 40% or more to their household. So when they lose income, it's really likely that the household has zero to very little income. And again, that has long-term and short-term economic consequences. So as Tish James said earlier in her remarks, the unemployment rate for women has fallen since last February to 5.4%, down from double digits. But the truth of the matter is that for Black and Latino women, the unemployment rate still remains at 8.5 and 8.9% for women. So what we have to understand is that these women are having trouble re-entering the workforce because many of the jobs that have been lost are not coming back, and there will not be a one-for-one recovery. So the last thing I want to say and talk about is we know that when we look at what's happening for these workers, that raising the minimum wage, it is the case in New York City, but raising wages across the board for restaurant workers, getting rid of the sub-minimum wage will really, really be important to making sure that lower wage workers and women in particularly can recover economically, and also helping women move into higher wage occupations that have clear mobility will also be important as we think about recovery.
Thank you so much for that wealth of information. There's just a lot more conversation we have to have on the issues that you just raised. But for a moment, can we just focus on caregiving, which is obviously continues to be essential and has been really highlighted during the pandemic, but also remains one of the most undervalued and underpaid jobs. What do you think are the solutions for that problem?
So, obviously, first of all, caregiving is one of the chief issues of concern for working women in this moment and during the pandemic. In August and September, when schools were slated to be reopen, 865,000 women fell out of the workforce. That is not a coincidence. And we know that even though some jobs have, recovered, the childcare sector and industry has not. They're still way below pre-COVID levels. And that is because the childcare sector and the care sector is a sector that operates on razor thin margins, and also those workers earn lower wages. And so even when daycares open, it's possible that many of those slots will have disappeared, and it will be hard for women to place their children, especially young children, into care. This moment, in my opinion, is a once in a lifetime or once in a generation kind of moment where we have an opportunity to imagine systems and structures that work for working women and families. I mean, it's really quite shameful that women are 50% of the workforce, and they're still struggling to receive support in the workplace and are not accommodated in any real significant way, especially related to issues of care. One of the things that, in terms of building equitable recovery is making sure that we have a strong care infrastructure. I believe the $40 billion in the American Rescue Package is a down payment on the kind of care infrastructure that we need, but long-term solution at the federal and state level to care is going to be really critically important to help women re-enter the sector. Re-enter the workforce. We are thinking about and proposing a national childcare infrastructure where no family pays more than 7% of their income spends on care, and that we treat care as a public good rather than a private obligation of families. This would go a long way to increasing the economic security of women and families. The money that women don't have to spend on care can be committed to other things like housing, savings, and wealth building. So again, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for us to get it right for women and families. And I'm hoping that at both the federal and state level, we're able to do that.
Since I know we have you for a few more minutes, I just want to ask you one last question. So in addition to more affordable, accessible childcare, what other protections or benefits should we be thinking about to protect women in high-risk jobs and low-wage work?
So, one of the issues that I think we really need to be paying attention to right now, in addition to obviously making sure that women, wages, living wage, or the minimum wage is just the floor. We need to make sure that these jobs are also quality jobs, and that these jobs are free of discrimination and sexual harassment. We know that restaurant workers, for example, experience high rates of discrimination and sexual harassment. And so again, getting rid of the sub-minimum wage is really very critical. Workplace protections for transgender women and women who are not non-binary women, or individuals who are not protected under law, making sure that we extend those full protection to those workers and individuals. Removing, many states have anti-secrecy laws, but, enforcement is another issue. And so making sure that, even if we have laws on the book, that there is an investment in enforcement so that we can institutionalize some of these changes. I think that's critically important. And many of the things Attorney General James mentioned in her remarks, so I won't lift up those. But, we have so much work to do. We can accelerate closing the pay gap in in my lifetime, our lifetimes. We just have to have the public will. If we do not do anything, if things remain the same, a status quo, we won't close the pay gap for another 40 until 2059. And for Black and Latino women, it'll take more than 100 years. And what that means in short is that my daughter and my daughter's daughter will not see pay equity in their lifetimes. And I think that we should all take note and do what we can to accelerate the closing of it.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for joining us and for all the work that you're doing to advance pay equity. We look forward to collaborating with you in the coming years. So now we're going to turn to thinking about how to equalize wages for women. And, to do that, it's imperative that we both focus on, wages for low wage workers, but then also think about sort of how we can, increase the number of women in higher paying careers. So I'm very pleased to introduce our next panelist. Leah Rambo is the co-chair of the National Task Force on Tradeswomen's Issues. Leah began her career as a sheet metal worker in 1988, and after 10 years was appointed the first female full-time instructor. She continues to hold the position of Director of Training for SMART Local 28 and serves on a number of advisory councils for New York City government. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's certainly a pleasure and exciting to be here.
So my first question for you is, one of the best solutions for raising women out of poverty is better paying jobs. Why should women enter the trades, and what are some of the obstacles for doing so?
That I find that question it always strikes me because I'm always thinking, why wouldn't they enter the trades? It is the pay is excellent, the benefits are excellent, and the work is fulfilling. So there's really no downside for a woman to enter the trades. But more importantly, it's a path out of poverty. You want to enter the trades so that people can take care of themselves, so women can take care of their families, their children, their aging parents, which many women aren't able to do. And there are obstacles. The obstacles aren't really from the women themselves. It's really from our culture, the environment around us. Some people say, well, we can't find them. They don't want to do it. They don't want to get dirty. That's all nonsense. People want to be paid well. People want to be able to take care of themselves. I have a brother and a sister that are both nurses, and they talk to me often about the nurse's aide, who typically gets all the dirty work on the job. A low-paying job, many times women, lifting people, heavy people, changing bedpans. People think this is suitable work for a woman, but if you're doing heavy work or dirty work in a construction trade where you're going to be getting paid probably 3 times the salary, then suddenly it's not suitable for women. So it's really just about those are excuses. Women belong in the trades, and women excel in the trades when they have the opportunity. I also think in terms of relationships, being in toxic relationships. Many women stay in toxic relationships simply for the fact that they cannot afford to get out of them. They don't know how they're going to feed themselves. They don't know how they're going to take care of their children. And I can personally see this is an effect that I see happening to women in the trades probably more than anything else. To see a woman to be able to leave a toxic relationship and know that she can move herself and her family to safety and still be able to take care of her children. And I think that's probably one of the most gratifying things that I see about women joining the trades. You know, the question is, you know, what are the barriers? Well, the barriers are the same as anywhere else. When there's an industry that's dominated by one group, that industry tends to not want to let other groups come in. It's simple. It's nothing tricky. It's nothing really different from what we've experienced throughout the rest of American history. And so, yes, there are barriers like sexual harassment, sexual discrimination that do happen on the job. And then there are other things, like, say, when we talk about childcare, there are some things that are more specific to our industry. Our typical day starts at 6:30 in the morning, maybe 7. And so now for you to be able to get to a job in New York City, our area is the 5 boroughs in Nassau and Suffolk County. For you to be able to get to a job at that time, that means you're probably leaving home 5:30, 5 o'clock. And it's hard to find daycare, childcare that's open. So I see that as one of our really large barriers that, you know, as a city that we really need to, and as a state to look at to see how we can help women, because if you don't have any place to leave your children, then there's not really much you can do. And this was something that recently happened with an apprentice of mine who's coming from Suffolk County, had to get to Coney Island, and she had a babysitter that would come at 6, tried to get her there even at 5:30 so she can make it to the job at 6:30. It simply wasn't possible with New York City traffic to make it there on time. So we have to be open as a state to figure out these ways, 24-hour daycare in various places, so that that's not a barrier to women being able to have these good paying jobs. You know, it is gratifying working for one of the building trade unions, and for my trade, sheet metal, in that once you find the people, then you can really monitor them to make sure that they're treated fairly. I mean, there are several ways, say, how do you get women? How do they become involved? Well, you look for them. If you want them, you can find them. We look in gyms, women's gyms, we go to colleges, sports teams, any place that there's someone who's fit, I'm looking for them to be in the trade. And if you're not fit, but you're strong, I still want you in my trade. And if you're not fit or strong, but you've got some real tenacity to you, I still want you in my trade, and you'll still do well. So women are everywhere. It's really about exposure, taking the time to expose, to go to places where women are and talk to them about the trades. Talk to them, let them see, yes, this is something that you can do. It's not rocket science. We're going to train you. And that's really one of the great benefits of an apprenticeship program, is that no training is required beforehand. We are willing to train you for the 4 years or the 5 years, whatever that program is, to make sure that that you know what you need and that you can eventually get to journey person status, which is what we call full book, or where you make your full pay. I know that the Office of Apprenticeship, New York State is what they call a SAC state, and they do have regulations, EEO regs, to help us to ensure that everyone is treated equitably on the job site. But we need enforcement of those regulations, right? We have them there, and we have to be able to enforce them to help people to be accountable. And there's so many places where they say there are goals, but goals don't mean anything if you're not trying to reach them, and if there's no one helping you to reach them. Because there are cases where people are trying to reach those goals, but they're just clueless as to how to do it. So having help from those same agencies and assisting sponsors and apprenticeship programs and employers on how to reach those goals is also something that's really very important, and able to make sure that women can be treated equitably and have equal pay. We do still have challenges of women being the first ones to be laid off on a job. But one of the things that can help with that is to have real processes put in place. The Attorney General, when she was on, she mentioned how that she has a task force dedicated in her office. Well, similarly, companies, unions, apprenticeship programs should also have task force specifically looking into, complaints of inequity, discrimination, and harassment, so that women and women of color who tend to have a higher rate of being harassed have a place that they can go to know that their complaints are going to be investigated properly and promptly with a real view to having a solution. I think with my local being part of the building trades, one of the places that we do look to is our pre-apprenticeship programs. Those are areas that it can really helps us to meet our goals in women and minorities. We have programs in New York like non-traditional employment for women. We have construction skills. We have the opportunities Long Island, and we have our career and technical education high schools. All these are places, if you're really looking to find women, those are places where you can easily find them and help them to have access into these really high paying and fulfilling jobs, because it's not just really about the pay. It's about having the type of work that you feel good about. We often say it's not a job, it's a career. It's not like just a little cute phrase. It really is a career. For me, it's been a 33-year career and dedication to this field, and I can still say that that is something that I love.
Thank you so much, Leah. Can you just talk briefly about one other issue? And we know that unions are critical to the fight for equity in the workplace. How has the sheet metal workers been a model for other trades?
Well, quite simply, we've put our money where our mouth is. That's really the bottom line. In our we have our convention every 5 years. In our convention of 2019, SMART, which is the Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers, changed all the language in our Constitution to make it gender neutral. They've included penalties for bullying, hazing, harassment based on a person's gender, their sexual orientation, their identity, their marriage. So they actually put this in part of our Constitution. Additionally, there's the Contractors Association, which is SMACNA, and SMART, have come up with a strategic plan specifically geared to looking at how to make sure that our union is one that's equitable, that's inclusive, and that's diverse, and that's something that starts from the top and just works its way down. Additionally, they've set up a recruitment and retention council, and I'm just going to really quickly read just to show you what the mission statement is. To ensure that all members are treated equally and given equal opportunities to succeed, to break down gender, ethnicity, and biases that divide us, to encourage, educate, and support diverse members to participate in leadership roles, to encourage, educate, and support diversity in the workplace, to identify reasons for low recruitment and retention of diverse groups and systematically address these issues, and to identify ways that we have been successful in retaining diverse groups and build on those, to educate and inform our industries about issues related to equity. And the vision statement is very simple. We envision smart union movement where all members are empowered to reach their fullest potential. And that's really what it's about. These points, they seem simple, right? As Americans, right? This is what we believe in. But how do we get that to translate into real life and to come up with a real strategic plan? And one of the things that we're doing, we are working currently with the University of Washington to set up mentoring programs for women throughout all of our local unions, and to see the effect that this helps them to start up women's committees in their individual locals.
Thank you so much, Leah, for joining us. So our next speaker will explore how we address systemic gender wage inequity through our laws and policies. Seher Kawaja is the senior attorney for economic empowerment at Legal Momentum, where she leads the Women Valued Initiative. Seher engages in litigation, policy advocacy, and educational outreach to advance economic security and workplace equality for women and girls. She is leading the PowHerNY Equal Pay Campaign Legislative Committee. Thank you for joining us today, Seher. So my first question for you is, we enacted many important laws at the state and the federal level. Why is pay inequity still such a problem?
Well, firstly, thank you so much, Megan, and thank you to the Attorney General for hosting this really important discussion, and more importantly, for your commitment to gender justice. It is so valuable. And thank you to Bev for your leadership in this area. And good morning, everyone. By way of background, for those who are not familiar with us, Legal Momentum is a national civil rights organization which for over 50 years has been at the forefront of utilizing the law to advance gender equality for women, including in the area of pay equity. And what we've seen in our work and in the data is that discrimination is a driving factor in perpetuating the wage gap, and that the law plays a critical, essential role in tackling this discrimination. So what has the law done for us so far? Federal laws like the Equal Pay Act of 1963 and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and parallel state laws like the one we have in New York, prohibit pay discrimination based on gender. And what equal pay laws specifically do is make it illegal for employers to pay you less based on your gender for doing the same work as someone of a different gender. In New York State, the standard, as the Attorney General talked about, is now substantially similar work. And it applies to all protected classes under the law. So we have broader protections and stronger protections in New York now, thanks to the work that so many people on this panel have done. And while we've made this critical progress and we've used these laws to advance pay equity, we've also found that these laws have been insufficient to effectuate the change that's needed. So, what are some of the shortfalls or gaps that we're currently dealing with? First, we found that the standard is somewhat stringent, right? Even as we are relaxing it, and it's often difficult for so many women to meet this standard, even in cases where, when you look at the facts, it seems, the pay differential seems patently unfair and unjust. We're also seeing that employers retain a lot of leeway to raise a broad range of defenses to justify pay differentials. Too many women fear retaliation, and for good reason, because a lot of employers across the country have policies on the books that actually prohibit employees from discussing pay. And, notably, and this is a huge problem across the board, is that too many people just don't have a way to find out what they're being paid compared to their male coworkers. And this is where a lot of the discussion around the importance of pay transparency comes in. We have these critical laws, but women just don't have the information they need to harness the power of these laws. So I think it's worth saying that really important steps have been taken in New York State, as the Attorney General discussed, to actively tackle many of these problems. And the salary history ban is one really great example of this. Yet, as Nicole discussed, significant pay gaps persist, particularly for women of color, and a disproportionate number of women are doing low-wage work. So we have more work to do to really address the multiplicity of existing barriers. And a key barrier we need to tackle is the prevalence of pay secrecy. To achieve meaningful pay equity, we really need to take concrete steps to enhance pay transparency.
Thank you. Can we talk a little bit more about sort of wage transparency? How can we use the law to address pay secrecy?
So today, with some exceptions, employers generally do not disclose pay rates in job postings or to applicants until they've, been offered the job. They do not internally share salary ranges to existing employees, and they often prohibit employees, as I discussed, from discussing pay with their coworkers. And this is typically in the private sector. We see a lot more openness within the public sector. And research shows that this type of pay secrecy creates substantial obstacles for achieving gender and racial equity, pay equity. And those unfortunately impacted the most are women of color and individuals doing low wage work. At the state level, we're seeing a range of new pay transparency laws and bills. And what I'm referring to are laws that give workers more information about rates of pay. But before I talk about specific legislation, I think it's really important to go through some of the real concrete benefits of pay transparency, as you asked about. So first of all, pay transparency creates leverage for women, people of color, and lower wage workers. When employers get to set pay in the dark, women and people of color who are typically coming to the table with lower salaries are more susceptible to wage exploitation, and they're in a weaker position to negotiate and are more likely to sell themselves short. This problem has only been exacerbated, as we've already kind of touched upon, by the pandemic, as high rates of women have faced unemployment, unprecedented levels of unemployment, and have been pushed out of the workforce for childcare reasons and for other factors. As these workers try to re-enter the workforce, it's critical that we create protections for them against these forms of wage exploitation. And research shows that women and people of color are in better position when they have information regarding their compensation. And this seems kind of straightforward. So the goal in enacting pay transparency laws is to help level the playing field and to give these workers more leverage in the workforce. Another really critical benefit of pay transparency is that it limits overt and implicit bias. Under our current environment, employers have free rein to inject their biases in making salary decisions, and the research shows that they do. Employers often assume men are more competent or reliable. And so the goal in enacting pay transparency laws is to shift the salary setting process to force employers to make their calculations at the front end, and to preempt all those opportunities for them to inject those biases within the decision-making process. Next, I think it's really worth noting, we've worked to enact all these laws. Pay transparency creates complementary legal protections. Pay disclosure will enhance the utility of our existing laws. Requiring employers, for example, to disclose salary range upfront limits their ability to rely on salary expectations, which we're seeing is employers are using as a workaround to the salary history ban. Pay transparency also really gives our existing equal pay laws teeth, because it gives workers a mechanism to figure out if they're being paid less than their colleagues. And like I said, this really activates our existing protections and gives them more meaning. It also creates efficiencies for employers, and I think this is a really important point. Pay disclosure and transparency requirements push employers to standardize and simplify their hiring processes based on job requirements and competencies, instead of these individualized assessments that often incorporate discriminatory factors. And I think, the implicit piece of this is really critical, because I think oftentimes employers don't even know that they're doing it. So in terms of the second piece of your question, Meghan, on specific laws, the PowHer Coalition has been working zealously to push forward pay transparency in New York. And as Bev mentioned, we are very happy to report that in time for Equal Pay Day this year, Senator Jessica Ramos recently introduced Senate Bill S5598, and Assemblymember Letitia Joyner has introduced Assembly Bill A6529. This is our New York State pay disclosure bill. And this bill would put in place a number of critical pay transparency protections for workers. So in terms of the overarching protection, it would require all employers in New York State to disclose, either in writing or electronically, compensation or range of compensation, any benefits and a job description, if one exists, upon issuing an employment opportunity. And that means that if an employer posts a job on Idealist or puts a sign up in a store window or releases an internal post, they must include this information there at the front end. Employers would also be required to disclose this information to existing employees at various junctures. The bill prohibits retaliation for anyone who asserts their rights under the law. Notably, it would allow any member of the public to report a violation to the Department of Labor, and the Department of Labor would be responsible for investigating and issuing penalties for violations. And it would also allow aggrieved applicants and employees to bring a lawsuit against an employer if they suffered a concrete harm. And this is, again, how this law kind of really seeks to hold up and lift up our existing equal pay protections. So, this type of legislation has the potential to really have a transformative impact, not just for women, not just for people of color, but really for all workers. And just to wrap up, while our focus is really on pushing this policy forward, which we think is a really good solution, there are a couple other pay transparency laws that we're seeing, as I mentioned, across the country. One is increasingly we're seeing laws that make it illegal to prohibit workers from sharing information about their pay. And we have that protection in New York State, thankfully, and we're seeing it in more and more states. And it's really important to challenge these workplace policies that are trying to limit workers' abilities to discuss pay. And we're also seeing a push for provisions that require either private employers, public employers, and government contractors to report paid equity data by gender, race, and ethnicity. And I believe we're going to hear more about that from Gloria.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that. So now we are going to dig a little more into data collection and analysis and talk about how data can really be used to uncover disparities. And our next speaker is leading the fight on data transparency in New York City. So I'm very excited to introduce Gloria Middleton, who took the helm as president of Communications Workers of America, Local 1180 in January of 2018, and is the first African-American and the first female to lead the 9,000 active member local. She was involved in the union's decision to file an EEOC charge against the Bloomberg administration, and as president, successfully brought the lawsuit to conclusion, winning a $15 million settlement for administrative managers. Thank you so much for joining us, Gloria.
Thank you for having me, Beverly. It's always a pleasure to be a part of this Equal Pay Day. This is one of my biggest fights as president that I have been trying to do since I became president of 1180. Tish, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Sorry we can't be in person on the steps of City Hall like we're used to, but it's good to know that in your progression as Attorney General, you have not forgotten this fight, and I know you can't forget this fight. The gender pay gap. This has been ongoing for decades. It's far too long that we have this conversation. There are so many factors that bring the gender pay gap up to fruition and that we can't even understand why it happens. There's the motherhood penalty. There's an unconscious bias and discrimination against women, including assuming that women will leave the workforce after they have children, and that children with women should earn less than men. The thought that they don't have years of experience because they've been home with their children and now they're coming back into the workforce, so they don't deserve the same pay as someone who's doing the same job. The secrecy of not knowing, as my sister Sahir said, of what the pay salaries are for people, and the fear of asking for increase in salary for fear of retaliation. There's the salary history with employers discriminating and keeping, again, secrets of who's getting paid what. And then there's the societal and structural sexism. influences the jobs that women work in, and those same forces mean that women most often take on the majority of the caregiving stuff, the housework, and the other unpaid responsibilities that men do not have. So in 2012, Local 1180 raised the issue of gender and race discrimination in New York City. And to just give you a little bit of background, we are civil servants. We, for the most part, civil servant workers take tests to get promoted, to get a job, etc. In 1978, a group called administrative managers were not unionized and noticed that they were working harder and not getting paid their worth. In 1978, when men had the job, their value for their doing the job was $92,000. Sometime shortly after that, we fought to bring in that title through the Office of Collective Bargaining, understanding that the title was not a managerial title. So we obtained the title as a union. And when we looked at what their salaries were after they passed the test and we were getting ready to go into collective bargaining, we noticed the salary range for some workers was started at 53,000 and went all the way up to 150,000. So what we noticed was when women of color started having this title, that the minimum never got raised. And depending on who you were and who, what gender you were, we noticed as we started to collect data that the high range was mostly white males. And so that's what brought us into deciding that we needed to do a substantial wage increase and decide to go into court. We started out seeing the $53,000 minimum. We went during the Bloomberg administration, we filed the charges, and Bloomberg filed against us saying that we were doing bad faith bargaining, and we finally had to go to arbitration and was able to raise the 53 to 63 plus, just through the arbitration. But still we had this battle of how to raise the minimum that we saw, the maximum ranged all the way up to 150,000. So we decided December of 2013 to go into federal court. In 2013, Local 1180 filed an EEOC complaint on behalf of our administrative managers, mostly women and women of color. That's the makeup of my local, as we are administrative employees that work in every agency in the city of New York. The complaint alleged New York City discriminated against administrative managers based upon sex, gender, and race in violation of the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Pay Act of 1963. In 2015, the commission findings stated that structural and historic problems resulted in the pay of minorities and women being suppressed. They agreed with us. The commission also found that the rate of pay for women and minorities was much less than their white male counterparts in similarly situated jobs and titles. Surprise. In 2016, New York City was not willing to conciliate with the EEOC, and the EEOC referred the case to the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Commission. The journey to justice took a long time. The union won the lawsuit against the city and we settled, and that's where the $15 million court-ordered settlement came into play. But of course, a settlement is something that's in writing. We need to get to the finish line to get our members paid. The city stalled for 6 years issuing back pay to administrative managers. 6 years. In 2019, 6 years after Local 11, they filed the suit. the city finally signed a stipulation of agreement in terms of the class settlements. And in 2019, December 2019, those administrative managers got paid. So they went from 53,000, and by the time they got paid, the new minimum was up to 67,000. Do you know what a difference that made in a woman's life, in a family's life? Especially living here in New York City. After that long battle, you know, we were very grateful to be able to do that for our members, which included, based on their gender and their race, everybody was able to receive some sort of payment. Of course, if you were white, the payment was less because this was a EEO lawsuit, so it was based on race and gender. So where do we go from here? We won that lawsuit. How do we change the way the city thinks in regards to how to pay women and people of color? Because we knew it existed throughout the city. It wasn't just this one title. So we worked with the city council and proposed some legislation, which did get passed, Local Law 18. In response to the Local 1180's lawsuit, the New York City Council passed a law requiring the city to turn over pay data to prevent discriminatory pay practices. This requires the Department of Citywide Administrative Services, DCAS, which I'll refer to collect data from agencies relevant to pay and employment of the city's municipal workforce every year, and to make this data available to the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics. And once the Mayor's Office sees it, then it goes to the City Council. Despite the law, a preliminary analysis that we received earlier this year of the New York City payroll data at the end of 2020, still showed significant gender, racial, and ethnic pay disparities in the city's workforce. Again, surprise, surprise. The analysis of salaries was roughly 180,000 full-time city workers. This analysis showed that male employees roughly averaged about $4,500 a year more than female employees. This is 2020, okay? Not 2000, not 1995, this is 2020. Black city workers averaged about $7,600 a year less than white workers. Asians tend to make $6,500 a year less than white employees. Non-Hispanic, non-Latino workers roughly average about $8,700 a year more than white workers. Analysis proves that overall, the city is paying men and white employees more in 2020. It still exists. Civil service society, public workers, you have to take a test. Collectively bargained workers, where there's a salary range. That's what we do when we collectively bargain. And those people who are in managerial positions, that's a whole nother story when it comes to pay equity.
Thank you.
It's time for a change.
Thank you, Gloria. I think the data that you highlighted today really demonstrates both how important data is to this pay equity fight and how much more work we have to do. So I just want to pause for a second for you and have all our panelists join us for a Q&A together. But Gloria, if we can just stay with you for a moment, because the numbers that you just sort of talked about are stark, right? And so what do you think are the next steps in ensuring equitable pay for city workers?
Okay, we first have to continue to get the data, because the way they sent the report didn't give us enough information, because we need to target what agencies violated more than other agencies. How do we corrected. There needs to be a commission like the Attorney General wants to set up in her office. The mayor, the new mayor needs to set up a commission that focus on equal pay, equal employment opportunity, all of the equals that need to be had. And there needs to be someone who monitors the agencies and see where these inequities are happening and call them on it. You know, just not say, I know we haven't, and then there's nothing done. That doesn't help us. Members need to speak up. You know, we also included in our settlement that we be able to have a labor management team that we can talk about how our members with education can be promoted and given pay equity as well. Because so many of our members are going to school through our own programs that we have that gives them BA and master's degrees in labor studies, that they get their degree and then they go to their boss and say, okay, I got a degree, you know, how can I get promoted or get more money? And there's no answer. So it's important that we set up a structure where we can be able to sit down with management and work collectively to make sure that there's equity across the board.
Thank you, Gloria. Leigh, I want to turn back to you for a moment. So the state and the federal government will be investing in infrastructure in you know, an effort to rebuild our economy. How can we make sure that women are given access to those new job opportunities?
I guess the first thing is to make sure that these jobs, you know, have the prevailing wage on them. So that's the first thing, right? That it's a prevailing wage. And then when they set up goals, to have a team, a task force to actively monitor those goals, and preferably include in the task force people and workers from within those building trades and those construction sites, because there might be some that, you know, will set up a goal for, let's say, for women, and you'll look and you'll see that right percentage on the job, and then they'll take that woman and put her somewhere else on another job. So, you know, those type of, you know, little tricks that do come up from time to time, you need someone who's in the know and knowledgeable to be able to make sure that that's not happening. And also make sure that the goals aren't set up based on apprentices, right? Still, even though apprenticeship is great, that's still the cheaper labor. Journey workers are what we call the full book. So making sure that those goals are set up with journey workers as their percentages or their goals. It could be a portion of apprentices, but you want to make sure that both are included. So, you know, for us, the real thing is not just having those goals, but some real monitoring of those goals and holding people's feet to the fire when necessary to ask those hard questions, and give them the assistance they need. If they really don't know where to find women or how to do it, then get them the assistance that they need so that they can you know, go ahead and do what's required of them.
Thank you. Sahara, you talked about sort of how salary disclosure legislation helps workers, but what are the benefits for businesses?
So I think, you know, when you think of it, first off, a lot of businesses, you know, will likely not be thrilled because, you know, businesses often don't want to have to change the way they're doing things right now. But I think what's really important about this approach is that it really does benefit businesses. You know, one, I think we've seen businesses do things in a particular way for so long, and we really want them to standardize, simplify, make those processes much more efficient by disclosing compensation information, making that very clear. I think, you know, there's the efficiency piece. There's also the, you know, aspect of this that protects them against litigation, right? I think a lot of employers, you know, we've seen this with the pay data disclosure piece as well. they don't know that these disparities exist. They don't know that they're perpetuating wage gaps for women and people of color. And so when you have that information, it helps employees, it helps employers to know what's going on in their workplaces and to guard against it. And this is a very simple way of guarding against it. Information facilitates the process for everyone involved, and it makes sure that you don't have to defend against a equal pay lawsuit, or and I think it also thought, you know, it's considered a best practice, right? It's something that it fosters fairness. And so I think employers really need to be thinking about being good employers, because it is just the way you should be. You know, treat your workers fairly, pay them fairly. That benefits everyone. You know, for businesses, it encourages retention and it encourages recruitment. And I think what we're hoping to see with a shift to this type of more transparent approach is that, you know, as more employers are forced, you know, I think there are a lot of employers that want to do this. They want to disclose this information, but it really puts them in a weird place when other employers are not doing it as well. And so I think when you put all the employers on equal footing and they're all doing it, it really just opens it up to everyone following what are the best practices. And then we're also going to, you know, hopefully see, you know, whereas one organization may be setting a particular salary for a similar type of job at, you know, $30,000 and one at 60 and one at 50. As we open that, you know, box up and we're seeing what those salaries are and those ranges are, we're going to see, you know, more of those salaries fall into a fair kind of appropriate place for everyone. And we're not going to, you know, have all of these huge disparities across the board where some people are just allowed, you know, able to, typically white men are able to negotiate themselves to, you know, some sort of windfall in their salary.
Great. Thank you. Beverly, you know, we usually look at women's policies and these silos, but the roadmap has a very different vision and approach, and is really looking holistically at the issue. Can you expand on that vision?
PowHer really is based on that model. At our table, you know, we have reproductive rights advocates, domestic violence advocates, equal pay advocates, and immigration advocates. We come together to learn together and to take action together. We support each other's campaigns, and they support the equal pay campaign. And it's very different. We've created a table of trust, and it brings us to different solutions. When you have people at the table, the conversation changes. We say that with women at the table, the conversation changes. Well, when you have all sorts of people representing different issues, we look at things in a much deeper and I think comprehensive way. And out of that work that we've done for many years now, during the pandemic, I think we asked the question, what are we going to do? What is PowHer going to do? And that's when we started this conversation that led to creating a roadmap. And the roadmap has a vision for really a paradigm shift. And it has a plan around 8 different topics. So this is what happens, I think, when you don't stay in your silos, when you look, you know, for what's going on around you in your community. And I think ultimately, we hope to build a different feminist movement in New York, an inclusive feminist movement. We call it inclusive gender justice. So that's not what's happening all over, but we're excited that in New York we've really built, you know, a collaborative team of 100 groups, you know, to work together. And I think the message is clear, you know, that women need all these pieces. We don't divide ourselves. We are all these pieces. And so all of these concerns come to the table to create, I think, better solutions. So it's an exciting project in that way.
Yes. So Leah, turning back to you for a minute. So when I read that your union's diversity and inclusion statements, it was really one of the strongest that I've seen. I'd be curious about how you work sort of internally to build consensus around that statement and what the union is prioritizing to sort of implement that vision.
So, I mean, both on the local level and on the international level, we're really very aware of the importance of diversity. So within my local union, I mean, we have what we call an officer of court compliance and a director of EEO, specifically looking at racial, gender, bullying, hazing, harassment, discrimination, and justice. And that's what we have internally in our local union 28. And then on the international level, our general president Sullers attended the Women Builds Nations conference several years back. And in the caucus by trades, he listened to what was happening with the rank and file members on the job site. And he was shocked and horrified. And he put a plan into place, which started off with building an international women's committee with various women leaders from local unions across our country. He gave us the ability, the support we needed to put our heads together and to come up with some real policies and proclamations to be ready for the international convention. And, we had several proclamations that were made. One is to increase the number of women within our entire SMART International, which is the United States and Canada, by the next convention. So to double the number, which is a pretty lofty goal, but that's our goal. And then he systematically started putting the things in place to kind of like, like the hot rod cars with the wheels, and you spin them back and you spin them and then you let them go and the wheels take off. And that's how we felt. We were just like so ready to go. We just needed the support. And General President Sullers has really set the bar really very high and giving us the support that we need to make these really crucial changes. Because at the end of the day, everyone knows that there really is something to this diversity, both public sector, private sector. Industries do better when there are more people at the table. When it comes to solving the problems, no matter what you look at, it is just a better team when it's diverse and inclusive. And because our industry in general has been so closed and over the years not been diverse, we've seen the drastic effect it's had on us in terms of losing our members. And we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in building trade unions to train people. And those hundreds of thousands of dollars go down the drain as people leave because the lack of inclusivity, the lack of diversity because of the hazing, harassment, and discrimination. So we've seen this in our industry internationally as a sickness that we need to to address. And it's just step by step. Like I said, his latest step is developing a recruitment and retention council, which specifically is going to use best practices to find out how do we get the talent, how do we retain it, and at the end of the day, to make it where people can be their best self within our industry.
Thank you. And just a reminder to those in the audience, if you have a question for the panel, you can email it to info@PowHerNY.org, PowHerNY.org. Sahar, can you talk about how people can support the pay disclosure bill? What can they do to be helpful?
Sure. So, I think we always say that if you support a bill, one of the, most important things you can do is you can reach out to your, state representatives and let them know how important this is. Write a letter, make a call, really, push legislation forward through your state reps. That's one critical way. I think another kind of way to do this is to educate workers. I think as workers, we need to be educating other workers about the importance of pay transparency. This is not something that's necessarily obvious to many people. It's not, we've been in this culture of pay secrecy for so long that I just think, we do need a culture shift where we're talking about the importance of pay transparency and educating our coworkers about how important it is. I think another thing workers can do is mobilize. As I mentioned, this pay transparency benefits women, it benefits people of color, it benefits low-wage workers, it benefits all workers, really. It benefits the LGBTQ plus community. This is something where workers really need to start mobilizing behind this. We hope to see that more as these new forms of legislation come out. And so that's another way. And then lastly, I think employers really need to step up. This is something, we are moving in this direction. I think, it's just a question of how long it's going to take us. And so, we'd really like to see employers start implementing these best practices on their own.
Thank you. So very quickly, I think when we have only 1 minute left, but as final thoughts on sort of how we can engage allies in supporting women's recovery right now, and in particular, since I'm here, the Attorney General's office and other agencies, what can we do to support this? Gloria, can we start with you? Gloria, you're on mute.
Just in summing up, we have to just stay engaged. The many contributions of women and people of color have been shortchanged. It's incumbent upon all of us to make sure we are working to right those wrongs and address the biases and discriminatory practices that contribute to pay and opportunity gaps. There is a history of New York City in this country where women and women of color have experienced racism, sexism, and all the other isms that have led to them being denied equality on the job in both pay and status. Women need to get more involved. In my own industry, the labor union, I would like to see more women in the president's role and in power, so that we can lead the direction of where women should be in the workplace. In the labor movement, men dominate the leadership roles, and that needs to change. Gender, race, or ethnicity should not predetermine the salary you earn in this city and in this country. But sadly, we know that in reality, it does far too often, and it needs to stop.
Thank you, Gloria. Leah or Sahara, any final thoughts?
I'm just going to say I'm appreciative to be in New York with all the challenges that we have. I've seen it being so much more challenging in other places, and just really thankful to Bev, Neufeld, and to Tish James for allowing us to have this forum, and for putting with their money where their mouth is, so to speak.
I would just say, to tack onto what Leah and Gloria both said, New York is not a bad place to be. I think it's worth noting that in New York, we have some of the strongest, most progressive laws on pay equity, and that's something we should be really proud of. But that being said, as Gloria mentioned, we have still these persistent kind of egregious pay gaps for, largely for women of color. And I think that's something we need to aggressively tackle. So we just need to be having more conversations, really brainstorming how we can use the law to tackle that piece of the problem, because it really needs focused attention.
Thank you. So I want to thank all of our panelists for the conversation today. I think it's such a critical one for us to be having, and I hope that our office can continue to support all of your work and implement your vision for equity in New York State. And so I just want to turn it over to Beverly for closing remarks.
Meghan, thank you so much for moderating this really rich conversation. And we are so excited to have the Attorney General's office as a partner. Enforcement has been an issue with the laws that are already in place, but it's going to become harder for workers now, with the pandemic. And it's going to be more challenging. So knowing that you're there, employers know that you're there, and that helps. That definitely will help keep us all straight, moving forward, being equitable. This has been such a great discussion. Thank you to every panelist for being here. It's just given us so much to think about. I also want to thank the PowHer board and all our team members who made this happen behind the scenes, of course. But biggest thanks goes to our Attorney General. She's really kept this issue going, moving it forward, keeping the light on it, and that's exactly what we all need to do. So we don't leave a meeting without saying what's next, what are next steps, right? And what we want everyone to do is, if you can, first of all, if you signed up for this, this conversation through Eventbrite, you're going to get an email with different resources with a link to the roadmap and other things that have been talked about today. So if you want to get that, just please, if you didn't sign up that way, let us know by going to info@PowHerNY.org, and we will definitely send that to you. You can spread the word. I hope you're enthused about all this now, and join us online today for a virtual rally. We have 25 speakers coming up to just share, their thoughts on what has to change, and also what we've done right and how the great work that has been done. So join us, use that hashtag I mentioned, which is #EqualPayNY. And lastly, if you can, tell your legislator, tell your representative, that you support pay equity legislation. And the one on the table right now is the salary range disclosure bill. So if you go to our website, PowHer, www.PowHerNY.org, you can get a link to send that letter that Sahar just mentioned. Stay engaged, stay talking about this. This is the only way we have moved this issue forward, is because we have not let up and we keep pressing, because women need equity. The women who have the large disparities, you saw the wage gap numbers, the women of color. We need to deal with the issues that cause this, the bias, and it's an exciting time for us. It's a hard time, but it's a really exciting time as well. So thank you all for joining the 15th annual New York Equal Pay Day conversation. And I know, working together, that we cannot just help women survive, but we can help them thrive. Thank you for joining us today.